15th of September 1940, 12:07 hours, Kingstown Y station on the Kent Cliffs. Valves glowing orange, headphones pressed to cold bakelite. The channel wind rattling the hut, while a young WAF operator eased a tuner across 38 to 42 megacycles and found the sharp, edged rasp of Luftwaffe radio telephony. The room smelled of dust, warm electrics, and tea gone stale. Up above, Messerschmitt Bf 109s with Fug 7 VHF sets rode contrails over Kent, the morning sun flaring off canopies as formations tightened and loosened like breathing. Voices carried further than wings. Inside the hut, a pencil tapped a log, time frequency call sign. Fragment. While a second operator pulled a direction, finding loop through its arc, to get a bearing that would drift to the filter room at Bletchley Priory within seconds. Paper turned into plots. Rup, Kurs 7 0, Esro he 5 F 1 0 0. The ether crackled, clipped and urgent in German cadence. Not coded, not guarded, just the business of war riding an AM carrier to anyone with the right coil and patience. Routine betrayed them. On the wall a clock ticked and a black telephone waited. Its line to 11 group at Uxbridge, so clean that a shouted bearing could race the Messerschmitts to their own target. Time was a weapon. Out over the Thames estuary the traffic thickened. One controller's staccato stepping on another as Luftflotte 2 pushed bombers and escorts across the coast, and somewhere in it a pilot's breath rasped as he eased a throttle, found his schwarm, and asked for a vector. He thought only his side could hear. Confidence bled through the static. The operators knew the voices by rhythm. Calm ones from JG-26 on a good day. Frantic ones when hurricanes from Biggin Hill clawed up under them. And they could feel the mood change before the plot board showed it. Sound led sight. Bletchley Priory's filter officers, eyes on the shifting mosaic of the southeast, took the bearings and scraps of speech and folded them into radar returns from Chain Home and reports from the Observer Corps, building raids out of electrons and ink. A net tightened. At Uxbridge, beneath concrete and earth, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park leaned over 11 Group's table as WAFs slid counters along tracks, their chalked heights and directions correcting with each call that fluttered up the telephone line from the coast. Decisions found altitude. The Bf 109s had good radios for their time, clean VHF narrower beam widths, better range than the old HF sets, and their ground controllers pushed vectors with crisp confidence because that VHF felt like a private room. Privacy was an illusion. On a 38.9 megacycles, an intercept cut through clearer than most, a fighter director from the Pas de Calais shore urging his rotten frere to drop to altitudes the British called Angels 15. Language differed. Physics did not. The WAF scribbled the height and shook her wrist, called it in straight, and watched the DF needle swing again, as the second operator hauled the loop. The pair of them knowing already what the ops room would do. Habits moved faster than fear. High in the pale air, contrails braided and frayed as nung. 303 Squadron slid up from Northolt. No 92 from Biggin No. 249 from North Weald, climbing into a geometry the enemy thought only he could see. The sky became a chessboard. On the German net a pilot cursed that his escort had drifted, asked for a course correction, got one, and rolled toward it with the easy certainty of a man who trusted the voice in his ear more than the shapes on his wingtip. Trust carried him forward. In Kingstown's wooden hut the room hummed, the aerial mast outside shivering in the wind, and every few seconds a new fragment arrived. Altitude, heading, a muddied unit call sign. Each one another thread slipped into the RAF's tapestry. Threads became traps. The Messerschmitts crossed the coast in sun and contrail, their Fug 7 sets hot to the touch, their pilots sure of ground guidance and timing, and the rhythm of a raid that should have been choreographed as precisely as a parade. Certainty met an unseen listener. The telephone rang again, was snatched up, and a bearing went up the line with a voice that did not tremble. In the rooms where the war was filtered and fought on maps, hands moved like clockwork, and squadrons turned as if tugged by an invisible tide. The map pulled at men. A new, harsh voice blurted across the enemy net. Someone stepping on a controller, someone already in contact. Someone who hadn't realized his fear rode the same carrier as his orders. And the WAAF wrote that too, because tone had intelligence of its own. Emotion transmitted. At 26,000 feet above Kent, a 109 pilot glanced down through broken cloud, saw sunlight flash on a wing that wasn't his, and keyed his mic to warn his swarm, unaware that the warning itself marked him like a flare for ears he could not imagine. Words gave his position away. On the ground, the operators leaned into the work with the practiced calm of people who know that half of war is listening, and the other half is believing what you hear. Silence fought with signal. No encryption, no scrambler, no sense that the air itself could be an agent. Just breath and metal and habits stitched together by frequency allocations and doctrine drawn up in peacetime. The ether made its own rules. When the first reports of contact came back to Uxbridge minutes later, tally, ho, shouted into clipped telephones, vectors reversed. Raids broken. The hut on the cliff did not cheer. Professionalism masked triumph. They only dialed a fraction higher and listened for the next adjustment, the next altitude, the next course that would feed the board and bend the fight by degrees the enemy never saw. Listening became leverage. And in that blue noon over England, with contrails smearing the edges of county lines and voices hardening as losses mounted, the Luftwaffe's pilots kept talking to their ground, never dreaming the same air that held up their wings also carried their secrets home. The radios leaked while the sky kept their confidence. The summer and autumn of 1940 drew two nervous systems against each other. Germany's ground-directed fighter control and Britain's dowding system. Each built from wires, voices, and the stubborn belief that information would decide the day. Nerves carried the fight. Luftflotte 2 under Kesselring pushed its raids across the channel from the Pas der Calais, its Jag-Geschwader, JG-26, JG-51, JG-54, riding shotgun with Bifenter 9Es fitted with Fug 7A VHF radios transmitting between roughly 38 and 42 megacycles, crisp and clear in amplitude modulation. Clarity bred confidence. On the British side, chain-home radar posts threw long fingers of HF energy out over the sea. The Royal Observer Corps filled in the low gaps, and at Bentley Priory the filter room fused returns and reports into coloured counters that slid across a great table under the eyes of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. The map was alive. Fighter Command's 11 Group at Uxbridge, commanded by Keith Park, acted on that picture with a strict economy. Scramble what you must. Vector with precision, fight short, and be home before the next raid. While a quieter thread fed into the same loop from huts along the coast. Whisper met thunder. This was the RAF and MA8Y service, a net of listening stations that caught enemy wireless in Morse and voice, with German-speaking operators transcribing and direction, finding Luftwaffe radio telephony in real time. Ears became weapons. The Luftwaffe doctrine of the day assumed its VHF fighter control was, if not secret, then at least private by physics. Line off sight, short range, hard to catch unless you were underneath. Privacy feels like a wall. But the South Coast Y stations could and did hear it. Bearings taken by goniometer and loop. Fragments logged in pencil and pushed straight to the filter room, where they corrected radar's fickle heights and sharpened vectors by precious thousands of feet. Bearings turned into altitude. The form was always the same, a German controller in calm tones. Grupp. Kazoi, 7-0. Hiu. F-Eans, null. And a pilot's acknowledgement in clipped syllables that were as distinctive to trained ears as a fingerprint. Voices made patterns. In the air, the Germans followed their Jagdleiterofficier's guidance with discipline, born on the Polish and French fronts, trusting the ground to place them over bombers and ahead of interceptors, while wings kept their Schogaraum tight. Habit felt safe. On the ground, British WAAF operators slid between frequencies where the enemy's tactical nets lived, wrote the numbers before the vapour faded, and passed them by telephone to women moving counters with rakes under a glassy sheen of light. Pencil scratches and Bakelite clicks made order. Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons talking on their own new VHF sets. TR.133s whispering at 118 to 132 megacycles could not hear the Luftwaffe bands, but their controllers could, and they shaped climbs and turns to meet raids at Angels 20. Rather than flail for height in gasping climbs, timing saved lives. German pilots, for their part, remained convinced that enemy reaction times came purely from radar returns, painted with clairvoyant precision. They did not imagine that every request, Wosign die Jager, Kurs, was another stitch tugged into the British net. Ignorance has a clear tone. Adolf Galland later wrote of the British system's uncanny readiness. Fighters, always at the right height at the right time, and while his finger pointed at chain home. The truth in those rooms was that radio intercept filled seams the radar could not. The picture sharpened by degrees. This mattered because height was blood and fuel. Too low, and a squadron bled speed into a losing climb. Too high, and it bled minutes it did not have. 100 meters guessed right by a WAAF with headphones could turn a meet into an ambush. Small numbers made big graves. The WI service did more than voice. Its army and RAF branches, Beomena Hall and Chicksands among them, vacuumed German Morse into Bletchley Park's hunger, but fighter commands' coastal huts aimed for the immediate vectors, altitudes, and the pulse of a fight measured in seconds. Urgency chose its path. German unit procedure names: Rot, Schwarm, Freijagd, Jagdschutz, flowed across the air as everyday words, and British annotations beside them grew into shorthand: escort drifting, busters at Angels 18, turning 270 now, the ink drying as the plots shifted. Language turned into arrows. The bombers' long-range Fuggy 10 HF sets and the fighters' cleaner Fug 7A VHF were designed for reliability and tempo. No scrambler circuits, no speech secrecy, only brevity codes and discipline standing in for anything a cryptographer would call protection. Doctrine mistook brevity for security. At night, the pattern would harden further into the German Himmelbett grid, Freya and W. Rasberg radars, cupping Bf-110 night fighters into British bombers through ground control. And the RAF would later send intruders with Serrate to hunt those vectors by their own emissions. Radios drew hunters, but in 1940s daylight, before the electronic war grew baroque, the exchange was painfully simple. Controllers guided, pilots obeyed, and Britain listened, fused, and moved before the enemy believed such fusion was possible. Simplicity hid danger. They are turning now. He's way null. A captured fragment from an 11 group log would read. The notation underlined once and followed by a rapid telephone call and a sector controller's voice. Tally-ho, Vectors 270, Angels 20. 2 rooms, 2 languages, 1 sky. 2 soundtracks overlap. German after-action reports complained of hurricanes and Spitfires appearing out of cloud banks and from the sun. Their timing uncannily right for formations they had not yet seen, but the inquiry never reached the unencrypted fighter nets that had sung the whole time. The blind spot sat on the table. That is the set up a confident air force, using excellent radios to move fast and fight hard, and a defended island using those same radios' honesty to shape a battle its pilots could survive. The ether took no sides, but the listeners did. The air war of 1940 ran on valves and habit, with radios that glowed like embers and doctrines that treated the ether as a private room for orders. Metal gave voice. In German cockpits, the Fug 7A sat compact and confident. A low VHF set around 3842 megacycles with clean AM speech that let a jag light off his ear push vectors to a swarm as if moving counters by hand. Clarity bred trust. Ground-to-air procedure flowed from the Bowden organization, the fighter control web that paired Freya plots, and observers with calm, blipped controllers guiding BF-109s and 110s to height and heading. Authority rode a carrier wave. The British sets had their own character. Older HF-TR-9 rasping and fading in the early months. Then the new TR-133 VHF coming into squadron service by late summer with crystal-controlled channels and a voice as sharp as flint. Sound became certainty. Angels. Marked thousands of feet. Vector. The heading. Tally-ho. The plunge to attack. Fighter commands procedure clipped sentences into tools, each syllable hun to move a formation by degrees. Words turned into geometry. On the cliffs and downs, the WWII service worked with civilian-made precision. National HRO receivers with plug-in coils sat beside RAF issue sets, dials big as watches. A slow-motion bullet of tuning that found enemy speech like a needle finding the groove. The room hummed warm. Direction finding on those voices used loops and Adcock arrays, their bearings resolved by goniometer. Each cut passed straight to the filter room to sharpen the height, and track that Chain Home had painted in long, honest strokes. Triangles became arrows. Chain Home itself threw out HF energy in pillars of miles, superb at telling range and bearing of a raid, poor at giving clean altitude. The WWII service RDIOS intercepts nudged counters up or down the chalked ladders on the group tables. Weakness met a helper. German brevity codes kept talk short. Call signs, units, quick course changes. But the net stayed plain speech, no scrambler, no inversion. Because doctrine and engineering agreed that reliability in a turning fight was worth more than secrecy. Simplicity carried risk. Inside a BF-109E, the microphone lived on the throttle, and the voice in the ear felt intimate. A ground officer speaking just to you, guiding you to H-hair and curse, as if no one else could possibly be listening. Privacy felt physical. In the huts by the coast, WWII operators learned the timbers of units. A JG-26 controller cool and sardonic, a JG-51 voice tight when fuel ran, a bomber escort net going ragged when timing slipped. And they wrote the numbers faster when the tone changed. Emotion had a frequency. The British plot was a fusion engine Chain Home, and Chain Home low for the blips, observer corps for eyes under the beam, and WWII service for the enemy's own altitudes and course updates, all filtered at Bentley Priory before 11 Group made the call. A nervous system found its rhythm. German sets were good sets, stable carriers, narrow channels, ranges that held at altitude, and that very goodness increased their leakage, because a clear instruction uttered at the right wattage travels far to a trained ear with the patience to wait on squelch. Excellence betrayed itself. Unit procedures made recognition easy. ROT and Schwarm, coordinating climbs, jag shuts, wrapping bombers, fray jagged, roaming ahead. To the interceptors on the ground, these were not just nouns but signatures, patterns that could be plotted. Language taught tactics. Controllers on both sides lived by the minute hand. For the Luftwaffe, ground control stacked escorts and timed bomb runs to a plan. for fighter command. The same ground control rationed scrambles and put squadrons, sun or down sun, in slim slices of altitude the enemy had already announced. Economy answered mass. Bletchley Priory's floor told the tale in movement. WAF sliding counters, chalking, Angels 18, then erasing to 20, as a Kingsdown bearing confirmed a climb on the German net, and each correction saved failing climbs, overheating engines, and pilots' lives. Small numbers saved blood. In the late months, British sets settled into their new VHF discipline, while German fighters still carried the crisp low VHF habit. Neither side could hear the other directly in the air, but the ground could, and that asymmetry lived in telephone wires that ran faster than contrails. The wire outpaced the wing. Even the gear had mood's eye valves drifted with temperature, headphones hissed with static when squalls came off the channel, and a controller's voice went thin when a relay somewhere chattered, but the trained ears rode through, finding meaning in imperfections. Practice tamed noise. German pilots believed their speech vanished into the blue, into range limits and line of sight. British operators knew better, because height and tropospheric bends and high masts near the cliff glossed a few more dB onto signals that weren't meant to carry so far. The nature lent its hand. The doctrine that mattered was faith. Faith in ground vectors. Faith in the map. Faith in the next call. And that faith is what made the leaks powerful, because every "ho-he" spoken aloud became a height corrected on a board that decided who lived. Belief cut both ways. The machine's character, then, was not just a radio box. It was a system of people and wires and polished procedure that gave shape to sound, and it worked because one side never thought the other could be inside their conversation. The either had a memory. 15th of September 1940, 20:03 hours. WWII station. Headphones hissed, loop aerial swung, and a WAAF's pencil hovered as a crisp baritone in German cut the static. Rupp. Kurs 7, null es on his way null null null. The hut felt smaller. On the wall the clock ticked once, twice, and a bearing slid by telephone to Bletchley Priory, while Chainholm painted a thickening smear over the Pas de Calais. Time leaned forward. At Uxbridge, 11 groups table glowed with counters and chalk. Our aid plots, angels' ladders, headings. And a controller's voice went flat on the tannoy. Northolt, Vectors 270, Angels 20, Buster. Words became movement. Over Kent. BF 109Es of JG-26 and JG-51 rode shotgun in a sun-whitened sky. Fug Savannah sets warm to the touch as escorts dressed their line abreast above Dorniers and Heinkels. Confidence hummed through metal. Rot dry Holton. Kurzoi 7 Enf. Another German voice snapped, close enough to sound like a whisper in the WAAF's ear. A new DF cut tightened the altitude on the group table by a precious 2,000 feet. Numbers turned into traps. Biggin Hill Spitfires clawed for height, oxygen masks biting. TR.133 VHF chattering with home-grown brevity. Angels 19. Turning starboard. Tally-ho when visual, while their opponents announced their own sky in clean German AM. The irony sang. Wo sendai J. Gear. He. A bomber pilot's anxious call bled through, and somewhere over the Thames estuary a swarm rolled to cover. Sunlight flaring on canopies at Angels 20, as if the whole raid had just inhaled. Fear crept into the carrier. Down on the cliff. The WAF wrote it as she heard it. Height, course. The edge in a man's voice. And the filter officer's hand moved a counter up one notch as calmly as if he were setting cutlery. Routine masked urgency. 11 group to Northolt. Vector 270. Angels 20. Tally-ho. The phrase went out again, clipped to bone. And 303 squadron tightened into 4 ship. Finger 4. Turning into a sun glare where contrails braided like torn silk. The hunt set. At 12:43 hours, just east of London, a green-nosed Bf-109 showed against cloud, and a Spitfire leader k'd his mic. Tally-ho! The single word punched. In the same seconds on the German net, a sharp "Achtung! Spitfire!" cracked across the frequency, stepping on a controller trying to hold his escort line, the ether filling with crossed syllables as if panic could be measured in overlaps. Discipline frayed. Gun camera film later would show a Do-17 yawing under cannon fire, crew doors bursting, a wing dipping as it sagged into cloud while escorts twisted late into the attack, already behind the geometry. Pictures told on voices. Rup. Runter. H. He eins a few NF null null, drehen null act and null. The ground urged, measured and precise, as if clarity could unbend time. In Kingstown the notation went down, and another call sped to Uxbridge. Calm could not outrun a bearing. From a Hurricanes combat report that afternoon, cited 24-17s at approx. 18-20,000 eft over London, enemy fighters higher. Attacked from Aston. One Do-17 broke formation trailing smoke. The paper smelled of sweat and cordite. Under the glass at 11 group the WAFs erased, or 18, and chalked 20, beside the raid marker, and Park's finger stabbed once at the board before he walked. No flourish, no shout. Toward the telephone to redeal his squadrons by inches. Authority moved quietly. Above, a German pilot's breathing rasped loud in his own headset, as he pulled into a sun he thought was safe. Eyes hunting for dots that shouldn't be there yet in his ear, the controller still sounded certain. Certainty lagged reality. Break. Break! Snapped an RAF voice on home frequency as a pair of Bf-109s fell into line from the wrong quarter. A Spitfire tunneled through their turn, fired one squirt, rolled out under their arc, and climbed again into a height band the WWII stations had drawn on a map minutes earlier. Invisible hands had set the stage. Across the RAF frequency, a sector controller barked a final push. All stations. Vectors 270. Angels 20. Tally-ho now. The room exhaled. Verdammt Sie sein Skonder. A clipped, unguarded exclamation cut the German net. No call sign, no procedure, just a human fact blurted into a war of rules. Surprise had a voice. In the hour that followed, Dorniers and Heinkels fell out of formation in singles and pairs, their escorts dragging late into turning fights that bled altitude and initiative, while squadrons from Northolt, Biggin Hill, and Hornchurch hit and climbed, always at the right height. Rhythm beat mass. 11 Group's diary would later measure it in calm lines. Raids turned back. Losses on both sides. Acknowledgements to radar and observer corps. But the operators on the cliffs remembered the texture. German altitudes spoken aloud, British counters sliding up, and a sky that obliged. Memory held the grain. When the last calls faded and the valves cooled, and the wind found its way back under the door. No one in the hut cheered, they logged, reset, and listened for the next neat voice that would give up a plan by trying to execute it. Professionalism swallowed triumph. Above them, the contrails smeared into the afternoon, and pilots on both sides counted their own, some over tea, some in lifeboats, some on concrete under a sheet, while staff officers wrote that the enemy had again appeared, with uncanny accuracy, at the decisive height. The adjective hid the method. And in debriefs that evening along the French coast, Luftwaffe officers puzzled over the timing and the placement, and the way controllers' perfect calls somehow met. Ambushes already forming in the sun, never suspecting the truth lived in their microphones. Arrogance met an eavesdropper